Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to be doing something pretty different for the channel. We're going to be reacting to a video. This is going to be one from one of the viewers of the channel. They actually provided this in the comment section of, I believe, the video where we talked about horizontal versus vertical progression. It was either that or it was one of the other videos, one of the Classic Plus Corner videos. And he wanted me to take a look at this, and I already have watched it probably once, I think. So I just kind of gave it a pre-watch, and yeah, I think it's interesting. I want to respond to it, so thank you very much for making this and allowing me to respond to it. The channel name is Maddie Miller, and the video is titled Classic Plus Vertical versus Horizontal Progression. I would appreciate it if you're watching this video just to give this video a view as well, like the original video. Even if you just want to put it on low or something, have it on in the background. Because I never like the idea of just kind of watching somebody else's content. In this case, it was given permission. I was given permission to do this, right? And kind of different in a scenario where, everybody has already kind of done it already, right? And the video is already widely proliferated. But in a case like this where not many people have seen the video, I would appreciate it if you guys just give it a watch. You can leave it on in the background if you're going to watch this video. So we're going to go through. I'm going to just talk about what I hear, and I'll pause it where necessary to kind of add my commentary. I figured this would be kind of like the easiest way to do it rather than kind of watching it a bunch of times and then just making a separate video where you guys can't hear the actual claims and things of that nature. So yeah, we'll just start out and go through it. One thing about that, he mentions needing to watch the first video. When I watched this originally, I watched this video first, and then I watched the other one as well. But I thought this one stands alone just fine. I think he does a great job explaining things, and I don't necessarily think that you need to watch the first video. So we're just going to go ahead and watch this one. And just to give some commentary on that, I think that is accurate. There's nothing controversial there at all. He's going to give an example of this right now. Okay, I just want to talk about this a little bit. I wanted to make sure he wasn't continuing that point, but I want to go back to this comparison actually here because I think it's a really good analogy. I'm an anime watcher myself, and yeah, this is definitely a thing that you see a lot in anime, in a lot of shows in general. But I think because anime tends to be very fight centric, or I don't want to say that there's a bunch of different types of anime, but out of all the shows that are very fight centric, a lot of them tend to be anime, right? So yeah, pretty much a lot of fight centric shows tend to have this problem. And it creates sort of this very weird dynamic. And I think here's the thing that I'll say that I found interesting about this comparison is that it's a great comparison. The thing is, though, I think that this is actually a lot worse in anime and kind of if you'd want to say literature. I mean, a lot of like classic literature doesn't really have the same problem because it's not really based around like combat. I feel like, or if it is based around combat, it's not based around kind of like characters progressively getting stronger over time, right? It's like more like battles or things of that nature, so it's a little bit different. But if you were to try and make literature around this, you'd have this problem. And anime has this problem, and it interferes with the storytelling in anime, because maybe not the storytelling. What I should say is that if you're going to have this type of combat system in your anime, right, where it's just straight vertical Dragon Ball Z or Bleach style, I think one of two things needs to happen. Like, number one, the fights have to be just absolutely visually crazy to look at, and the character art has to be insane. This is, I think, the direction that Bleach goes with it. I don't think that the story of Bleach in itself is super compelling when compared to like maybe other anime in its class. Like, Bleach is considered a really good anime, and I would say overall, right? A lot of people are going to nitpick that. They're going to be like, oh, it's like it's just some trash anime that's like popular or whatever. But I think Bleach has a lot of things going for it. I just don't think that the story is necessarily one of those things. Not to say the story is horrific, but it's just not like the primary thing for me. When I've always watched Bleach, my attention has been drawn to like the art and the just like how the fights play out, the creative thoughts of the powers in the series. And ironically, this is one of the things that kind of burns Bleach in its well, because it uses this sort of linear scaling system, right? The idea is you have all these Soul Reapers. I'll actually, this is relevant to what we're going to be talking about here, so that's why I'm kind of getting into it a little bit. But little spoilers on Bleach if you haven't seen it. The idea is basically that everybody has these swords. The main characters, they're kind of like gods of death, and the swords manifest in a certain way based on that character's personality. So, for example, like one character is like the ice sword, Yorimaru, and it's like he has all sorts of cold abilities. And then another character might have like a lightning sword or something like that. And they all have different swords that kind of reflect their personalities in certain ways. And originally you get this concept and you're like, wow, that's actually kind of really cool, right? So they have the sword and they have powers, and the sword kind of transforms, or it transforms them. And, you're thinking, oh, this is going to be really interesting to see, like, what all these powers are, right? And then once you have all these powers, then it's going to be like, well, how do they interact with each other? It seems like it'd be a really fun topic, right? You could actually make tons of videos about this, of, like, who do you think would win, like, what battle, right, based on what powers they have. Unfortunately, a lot of the conversation in Bleach, instead of kind of speculating about how the matchup would actually go between characters in terms of like how their powers get used against each other, what ends up happening is it just becomes sort of like a power scaling argument where you're just kind of looking through the story and trying to find ways to like narratively show that this person is like on a higher plane of power than the other person. Because what happens in Bleach is if you're on a higher plane of power than the person before you, this is like, not in every case. It's not that every character that's like maybe slightly stronger or has more like spiritual pressure is always going to beat the lower character. It's not always like that. But at a certain point, characters just hit a wall. So, for example, more spoilers here if you're not familiar with Bleach, but there's this character called Soifon that has this really cool ability where she has this like blade, and if you hit people, it marks them as a butterfly in the spot that they got hit. And then if she hits you again, you just instantly splat, basically, right? It can, take out anybody is the idea. Except it actually can't, because characters that are, just way more powerful than her don't even get affected by this ability, essentially. She's not like a main character, right? She's kind of one of the sort of side characters, and her powers are basically sort of useless against the kind of main baddies of the series because she actually just cannot damage them with her ability. So all these kind of things that you have in your mind are really kind of like, they don't pan out too much. When you think about all the matchups between characters, you can really only start getting into that nitty-gritty when you talk about characters that are a similar power plane. And I want to just compare this to another show, because there's this show, Hunter x Hunter. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it actually does powers in a really interesting way that kind of avoids this problem. And it's very much akin to like what we're talking about here with horizontal versus vertical progression, whereas something like Bleach is a great example of vertical progression in anime. Something like Hunter x Hunter is a great example of horizontal progression, or what I'd say, we're making kind of like the same, we're doing the same thing that we're trying to do in WoW, right? Where the idea is that the power scaling is not as big of a factor in Hunter x Hunter as it is in Bleach. The idea is more that there's this system called Nen. That's how the power system in Hunter x Hunter. And there's like, was there 5 or 6 categories? I forget all the categories off the top of my head, but each one is like a certain thing. Like there's one for conjuration, there's one for emission, which is where you make projectiles or whatever. There's one for enhancer, where it's going to be like you're enhancing your strength and things of that sort. And the idea is these sort of can like counter one another. And the fights are kind of really based off of trying to understand your opponent's Nen before they understand yours, and then adapting your Nen to be able to fight them and take advantage of a particular situation. So for example, like if you're a conjurer, right, maybe you are really good at tricking people, right? You have, you can conjure things that might throw people off, or you can conjure items that might even be useful for you to a certain degree, right? So you're kind of like almost like a magician type archetype. And this can be really powerful and really deceptive in certain cases, especially if you're really creative mentally in terms of how you're using the conjuration. One of the actual main protagonists in the show is actually a conjurer at base, and they kind of give him a super power boost later, but it's a cool specialization, right? The problem is that would sort of seem OP on the surface, right? But if you're an enhancer type and you kind of catch this guy before he's able to like really conjure something, or he doesn't have a plan going into the battle, if he doesn't have a plan and he just has to fight an enhancer one-on-one, he's probably at a super big disadvantage, right? Because this other guy is just way stronger and likely way faster because he can enhance his strength and speed. So the conjuration thing is sort of balanced out. There's almost like a rock, paper, scissors element. And even when that exists, it's not a pure rock, paper, scissors element, because you can still adapt your Nen like mid-battle if you understand what you're doing. So maybe he could conjure something like an armor piece that would make him more resistant to the enhancer if he was about to be struck, or he was going to have like issues dealing with the enhancer's strength or something of that nature. So the system is kind of really adaptable, and it kind of captures more of what I think Bleach was originally going for. And there is a thing kind of like spiritual pressure in Hunter x Hunter where it's called aura capacity, but it's not strictly the same, right? And a lot of characters, I would say that at least in the series, the aura they're able to maintain or obtain is a lot closer to one another than in a series like Bleach, where some characters are almost on like just a different interdimensional plane. And what this allows Hunter x Hunter to do is it allows them to create it allows them to get into the nitty gritty in the fights, right? It allows them to create like really cool fights that aren't just visually cool, but actually like intellectually cool in terms of like how people use their abilities. And it's like a lot harder for Bleach to really do that, because you end up with characters that are on just different tiers of power and different planes of power, right? So I feel like it does hurt the narrative a little bit when you have these strictly vertical progression of stories, and at that point you super rely on the main story being like just so good, right? And you also have problems introduced because now it's like you need to kind of give your characters challenges. Like any character in a story, there has to be conflict basically in any story, right? And in particular in these fighter animes, it's probably going to be like an actual fighting conflict. And that's really hard to kind of do, as this guy says, when you have to keep just escalating the baddie over and over again. And then you run into the problem of, so you're having the main character maybe catch up to the big baddie character, but then the other characters in the series have to kind of catch up if they want to be relevant as well. And most of the time they don't, essentially, right? So you end up with like, it's normally like the protagonist and then like the villain, and then all the other characters are just like below them. Not in every case, obviously, and there's usually like, people that are closer to the villain, closer to the protagonist that maybe are a little bit closer in strength, but you end up with a lot of these characters that just become fodder. And Hunter x Hunter has some fodder characters, but they're usually kind of just weaker overall, right? So in other words, not only is their Nen weaker, but they're just less intelligent, less adaptable, you know what I mean? So they're kind of like earned fodder status, as opposed to in Bleach, people just become fodder status overnight, almost for no reason when characters get power-ups. So yeah, I do think that this is a problem in anime. I don't think it's as big of a problem in video games, though, is kind of where I wanted to go with this, because there's not, I don't know, there's just, like, at the end of the day, there are just brute force solutions we can have to deal with power creep, okay? Like, I think I talk about in the video where we talk about horizontal versus vertical progression, you could easily just, like, start removing raids, right? Or, like some other people have mentioned, I think Guzu is the one who mentioned this that I seen originally, but I was thinking about this too, where the idea is like let's say, Molten Core, it's probably going to stay relevant for a while, right? Because even in Naxx, technically Molten Core is a little bit relevant. Even if it's not relevant to do, you can't like go in there and solo it, right? But maybe it's a thing where after a certain point, there's a huge power gap. Like, let's say you have, like, 15 tiers of raids out. Now it's like, well, who's going to be running Molten Core anymore? Well, at that point, you might actually just be strong enough to go in there and kind of, like, solo stuff. But the reason is, like, why would you go in there and solo stuff? I think you could add, like, cosmetic stuff in there. I think it'd be fine. Like, if you had a transmog system, this would be a great way to implement that. Maybe the bosses could drop pets, things of that nature. I've seen other people suggest things like they could drop, things that kind of help you in your, even though you're kind of like in the complete end game now. I don't know how much I like that, because you don't want people having to go back and do all the old raids, right? I think what you could maybe do is you have a system where you need to get some items for some type of progression on your main character, and they can come from a bunch of different sources, right? So they could maybe come from some stuff out in the open world. They could come from PvP. What I would say is, like, you know how in some versions of WoW you can upgrade your gear, right? So maybe there's like a currency that you can get per week that allows you to upgrade gear, and it's capped at a certain point, right? So you can get that maybe from PvP out in the open world. And then I think adding these old raids and having these be a viable source of the currency, and then maybe not giving currency in the new raids to force people, you can get gear in new raids. If you want to upgrade it, you need to get it, this currency from either, in the world or PvP or old raids or something like that. And that would kind of it would make it so that if you want to run these things for nostalgia's sake or whatever, you can, in order to get some of this old currency, or maybe for transmog pieces. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. And, I think that's the way you would kind of make them relevant. I don't like the idea, though, ever of people having to go through all the prior content. And I think just realistically what you can do is you can just kind of add catch-up things into the game. So you can, at some point, you just... The raid that you're going to start in as a new player is not going to be Molten Core once you're 15 raids deep, right? And there's going to be some 5-man or some 10-man you can join pretty much as soon as you hit 60. That's going to give you gear that is going to allow you to participate in tier 15. And you kind of just keep shifting the goalpost, on and on and on. And you kind of, you do that infinitely. And I don't really think that this is a problem necessarily. I just like, because you can just brute force solutions, right? Whereas in the series or the show analogy here, it does become a problem a bit because, like I said, now it makes a lot of the other characters kind of useless to the plot, at least in terms of their combat abilities, right? And it forces your main character to have to progress in a very linear way, right? And then also it kind of takes away a bunch of, other ideas you can have, like, narratively to do cool stuff, because now, you can't do cool stuff with other powers anymore because that character's powers don't affect the strongest character's powers. So it's much more of a problem in media and storytelling, I think, than it is in video games. So keep that in mind as we kind of go forward. The premise that's kind of provided here is that this is like a bad thing and it is a problem, and I think that's actually where I kind of take issue. I take issue almost at the core or the root, where I don't know that this is actually a problem. Like, the solution's not going to be elegant, but we have solutions. I want to actually go back just 1 second here because I want to. So I mean, I understand like the core of what he's saying here. I don't know about this though, guys. Like, I think people would really not like this. So this particular, not saying that what he's saying here is like his final thoughts, right? This could, this might not be like his actual final vision for everything, but what he has listed here, probably just like a prototype idea, but I think if you did have this, I just want to comment on it since it is on screen. Like, this is, people like the idea of their gear getting better while leveling. I think that's like a core thing. So I don't think that they would just want this stuff to level 60. And then I really don't think that they would like resist sets, in the Priebus either. So, yeah, I don't know. We'll just keep that in mind as we move on, right? Yeah, I think that that's fine. Like, there's not really any, like, problem with doing that. Like we said, we can brute force anything we want because it's a video game, right? So. Okay, hold on. One comment about this. So, I think in terms of the set bonuses and things of that nature, I tend to like it more. And I think this is obviously a risky development strategy, but I think when it actually works, it can pan out really well, right? And obviously, if it doesn't work, it can go really poorly. But I sort of like what they were trying to do, I feel like, with a lot of the set bonuses in the original game, in the sense that they didn't seem to necessarily be balanced around a specific thing like we're talking about here, and I don't really know if I like that. Like, I don't like the idea of, like, hey, there's going to be a lot more mobs, so we're going to give you a lot more AoE threat in this new content, right? And it's like, well, yeah, but shouldn't part of the difficulty there also be like maintaining threat on the mobs, right? So if we're just going to provide you with a solution to the problem, like I don't know that I like everything being so simple as like, hey, there's this kind of like obvious mechanic that we're throwing at you, and then we're going to give you a solution to that mechanic within the gear innately. I kind of like the idea of it's more like, okay, we're going to give you some of this gear, and you're going to decide if it's relevant at all or how it's relevant. Sort of like I think things like Shaman Tier 1 is kind of cool, like the 8-piece, I didn't really play SOD, but apparently Paladin has like a cool thing like that. They have like a Valnir effect from their Molten Core set. So something like that's kind of cool. Right? And like something that I really like from vanilla is like Rogue's 5-piece Night Slayer, where the idea is that like, yeah, it does basically nothing in PvE, but it actually allows kind of new combos to open up in PvP. So things like that are really cool. Stuff like this is sort of a little bit less cool, I think. Not, again, because of any of the specifics that we're talking about, but just because the idea of, like, it seems like we're okay, guys. It's going to be AoE content, and we're going to give you sets that, like, augment your kind of AoE, right? So we'll keep playing for a little bit. And I tend to agree with this, and you see this even in games like RuneScape that pride themselves on horizontal progression, right? Where there's like some raids in RuneScape, like I think Theater of Blood is one that comes to mind, where a lot of the items are now just kind of outpaced by other items that are. It's like, why would you use this when you can just use this, right? Not all of them, but quite a few of them, and this tends to happen. Now, obviously, this isn't necessarily the end of the world, because what's probably going to happen is something like Theater of Blood is that the items are just going to get revisited or something and potentially buffed a little bit, right? But it does kind of create this issue where once you get so many items in the system, you still run into that problem where, like once you have, like, let's say you have, like, 20 daggers in a game, right? And they're all supposed to have their own little niche. You kind of start running out of places to find a niche for. and you either now are making things that are like really overpowered and really hard to kind of they're unique but they're really overpowered, right? And it's hard to kind of bridge that gap in any way, or you're making things that kind of risk just getting lost in the shovel, right? Because if it's not explicitly better than the other cool, interesting dagger, then it just falls all the way to the bottom of the pile. So, there's definitely going to be some things where, you can have certain daggers for different jobs, but eventually there's not going to be like enough jobs, So it's funny because a lot of people, I'm not saying that this creator's, or this person is doing this, but a lot of the people that really champion vertical progression will say that like it's like the perfect solution, right? But it also has problems in itself, just in the sense that eventually you can kind of oversaturate with items in a similar quote unquote power tier, right? Whereas that's actually a problem that vertical progression doesn't face, because vertical progression, just no matter what, is going to keep going vertical, right? So you can call it a problem if you want, but for the system itself, it is just like the natural thing to make a bigger, better, badder item in the next phase, right? Just one comment here. This isn't to be like too critical or anything, because again, a lot of this is just like kind of spitballing things of that nature. But that part didn't seem to really mesh with the charts that we've seen earlier, because in the charts that we saw earlier, it seems like we wanted to start implementing this type of gear even in like Molten Core or whatever, some of the other raids, right? Whereas now it's kind of like we're saying, the old content is going to maintain all of its gear, and we're just going to get new gear from the newer stuff, right? So I'm not really sure if he had just a change of mind there. But yeah, I'm not really too sure about that, but it's not really a super important point either, so. Yeah, so I don't want to get too into the actual abilities here, because that'd be kind of like going off on a tangent. That's not the point, as he's saying. But again, I think we're kind of going into that thing where it's like now we're just designing gear specifically for the raid. And I think that can be a bit tedious for players. So New World kind of tried this. Now, New World did it in a way that probably wasn't really as interesting as this, to be fair, where the idea is that you just want protections for certain types of dungeons. So, for example, if you did a dungeon that had, like, Lost as the mob type, you would want, I forget what it was called, like a Lost Ward or something like that on your gear. And you would want 5 pieces of armor with that. And then depending on the actual type of elemental damage you would, or if it's physical damage, you would then put a gem in that corresponds to that. So the idea is you kind of ended up with different gear sets for different dungeons, and people just didn't like the idea of like, okay, I have to collect all this stuff. Like I think a lot of people like the idea that their gear is like BIS, and they just go into any like dungeon and it's BIS. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily has to be true, but something like this would be very radical, right? Because even in like, let's say something like PvP, for example, on my rogue, right? Like, I could make a set that I think if I had to play with a set on my rogue for all of eternity, I could make a set and be pretty happy with that. But that doesn't mean that would be the best set for all circumstances, right? So, for example, if you ever like watch Perplexity or something like that, or watch one of his rogue guys, he actually has like a bunch of different kind of sets that he's made that aren't like actual sets, but just sets of gear that he's kind of compiled that he posts on his website or whatever. I think it's his Discord, where the idea is like, if you're trying to do this, if you're trying to do open world PvP, I recommend this. If you're trying to do battlegrounds, I recommend this. And some of it is stamina swap, some of it is things like using the Night Slayer 5-piece, some of it's not using that. Some of it's making more use out of the PvP gear, some of it's not using that, right? So you can kind of use you can kind of almost do this with some of the gear in the game now. But this is going to be like a really big change. And it almost is like what the movement example is one that I kind of really don't like. Because it's like, let's say that you get to the last boss and everybody needs like one of these movement ability items to basically down the boss. I think that's kind of lame, right? Like, I don't like the idea of like, and then it also creates the situation where, you have to get the gear, like you can't actually down the boss first week, which I'm totally okay with that. I mean, some people might disagree there. I think it's typically bad to gatekeep things behind player power like that. Like, I think if there's a raid that comes out after Naxx in the official game, you should be able to be full BIS, or you don't have to be completely full BIS, but like pretty full BIS in Naxx, and be able to walk into the next raid, and you should be able to kill every boss in there, assuming you have the requisite skill level and players know what they're doing, right? So I don't like the idea of you have to like farm an instance to get items to then use in that instance. Then also, like, this could be easily fixed by just turning off these items in PvP, but I think that a lot of these, like, just examples of things we have here are crazy broken. Now, again, I don't want to harp too much on these examples because that's not the point, but I guess my point would be anything that you would add that would be very drastic, whether it be like adding like a Wrath ability, right, from Wrath to, Warrior's Pants or whatever, or whether that be, giving like Warrior's Blink, which I've seen other people talk about. I think Guzu talked about that in his Classic Plus video, where it's like you could have like a chest that would give Blink. All of this stuff is just going to be absolutely insane in PvP, in a bad way, in my opinion, right? And it's going to be like really, really frustrating. And then in some cases, like in a lot of cases, realistically, right, it's going to be so hard to balance this. But more than that, it's going to be a problem of, basically, you could think of this class as maybe it only hits viability after getting this item. So imagine you're talking to somebody and you're asking them like, oh, how are warriors in, Classic Plus PvP? And you're like, well, they're actually like really, really bad for the first like 4 phases of the game in Classic Plus. But then in the raid after Naxx, you get this chest piece that allows you to blink. and then you actually can just kill any squishy you want because you can get right back on. You can follow the mage blink for blink. You have them hamstrung. They can't do anything. You're just wailing on them. You know what I mean? So it's like, now the mage might also get something really OP to counteract that, but it basically throws off like the whole current sort of PvP dynamic. And I think that when you add abilities, you have to be really careful, especially if it's not something that you would like. It's one thing to add abilities from Wrath, for example, right? Because it's the idea is that, or TBC or whatever expansion, because the idea is that that ability was probably designed to fit that class in mind if you're porting class to class. But when you start giving one class another class's abilities, this inherently becomes really broken, right? Because the class is not supposed to have that ability, right? Obviously. And throwing that into the mix, I think that's like almost like a hard line that shouldn't really be crossed in a class game like this, where there's especially like competitive modes like PvP and things of that nature. In like an RPG, you see this sometimes. Sometimes with like really powerful items granting you the ability to access with other class. For example, in Path of Exile, there's these jewels called Forbidden Flame, and the idea is you can use another Ascendancy's ability like in your Ascendancy, so you can take something from something else, which is like insanely OP if you do it like the right way. So that is it's cool in a game like that because there's not really tons of implications, right? Like if every character can kind of compete doing the PvE, like if they can all get through the campaign and they can all kill the bosses, then it's not really a big deal if one character is just kind of does everything better. I mean, it can be to some degree, right? If they're like way better, but even then it's not like the end of the world. In a game like WoW, it would feel like oppressive, you know, and it would feel really bad for everyone that didn't have that piece of gear, right? It would just feel absolutely terrible. And if you thought like competing over things like Drake Fang Talisman's bad, right? Imagine like a chest that gave some really unique, crazy ability for PvP. It would just be like insanely sought after, right? Or PvE, to be honest, for either one. So yeah, I'm not really a super fan of stuff like this. I'll continue here. I do want to mention something on this. This is kind of a good idea, I think, in terms of like, you know how I was talking about that solution in general, kind of like before for vertical progression. You could actually use something like this in a vertical progression system, where the idea is you sort of upgrade the old content. So for example, like by the time Molten Core is really outdated, right, you release like a 10, 20-man version of Molten Core, maybe, or something like that, that's sort of functional to ZG. You spruce up some of the bosses a little bit, you make them drop better loot or something like that. And maybe, you know, if you want to do completely different loot, you can do that. You could also do something where if you had transmog in the game and you want to maintain the ability to get some of that stuff, you could add like a transmog token from the boss or something, you know, that doesn't actually give stats or something, but is just used for transmog. So you could do all sorts of stuff like that. And that would be an interesting way to keep content relevant and also help them kind of bridge the gap to new releases, right? So in other words, like it's not like they have to create as many new raids, because the idea is you would have like one main horizontal content patch, right? And then instead of having to create a whole bunch of new content like dungeons and new raids entirely to boost people up to the level where they can do that content, you can kind of reuse some of the old stuff, and that helps them in their development cycle a bit, so they can keep putting out kind of like the big new raids. And then obviously you can still make dungeons and things of that nature, but they wouldn't have to be added every content cycle, because what you wouldn't want is like, maybe it'd be a lot if you had to come out with like 5 new dungeons after every 4 to 5 tiers of raids, you know? I mean, I guess they kind of do that with the expansion. That's how like expansion cycles currently are, but that's a lot for them, right? So if you take more off their plate, maybe you get better quality content in return, right? So just a couple things to think about there. Oh, I see where he's going with this now. Okay, so he's basically saying that it's like the normal thing. So you're going to complete all this, and then you kind of get into the... Okay, I see now where we're going. This is a little bit more clear. I want to just go back a second here. Where are we? Oh, in terms of this, so this is true, but I don't think that you don't have to do this, I guess, right, in order to do this. Right here, I'm not saying that he's saying that you have to do that. But I've heard a lot of people talk about, this being like a pro in terms of like adding abilities and things to gear. Typically, I'm not a fan of adding abilities to gear because it's like it can feel bad not having that. Like I'll put it like this, okay? Think of something like the Priest 3-piece tier 2, right? I think this is almost like a good, or the Shaman maybe Chain Heal 3-piece tier 2. These are kind of almost happy mediums, right? Like let's say if instead of getting 3-piece tier 2 and it buffs your Chain Heal on Shaman, you got like 3-piece tier 2 and it gave you a new ability. Or maybe you just get one item that gives you a really powerful ability. Now the problem is that and presumably you would want these abilities to be good, right? Because otherwise why are they going to be in the game? And so if you do that, now everybody that doesn't have that, it feels really bad. Now you can make the same argument about the current system with the 3-piece tier 2 for Priest or the 3-piece tier 2 for Shaman, but I would say that it doesn't feel quite as bad. To give you an example, in SOM, I was raiding in 6 to 7 raids a week, 40-man raids, and then doing a bunch of the other 20-mans and stuff on the side, right? Now, I had 3 or 4 priests I was doing GDKPs on, and I think only one of them for a period, obviously eventually they all got the stuff, but for a while, only 1 or 2 of those priests had 3-piece tier 2, right? And, it's not good not having it, but it's very playable still. Your class doesn't all of a sudden lose the ability to compete completely. Now, obviously, if I was playing against myself or playing against another really good priests, then obviously I would probably heal less than them, right? Because I don't have the set bonus, so they just have a mathematical advantage on me. But you can kind of make do with not having it. But like, let's just say, for argument's sake, Chain Heal wasn't an ability in the Shaman's kit, and then you gain Chain Heal from 3-piece tier 2, right? Or just from a piece of gear. Now, like, and it's by far your best ability. So at that point, anybody that doesn't have Chain Heal just feels like terrible, and they feel like useless, essentially, right? And that gear, that piece of gear, or those 3 pieces, now become even more mandatory than normal, right? Like, it's almost now impossible to make an argument. It's already hard to kind of make an argument for some of the good set bonuses, right? To like remove them or whatever. But now it's impossible. And I feel like this also can be retroactively applied to this idea that he was talking about with the AoE stuff, where now like when we talk about AoE sets and things of that nature, is that the only kind of gear that's going to be available in like the new content, right? Because one of the things that I think is actually cool about stats at base is the idea that you can play around with them, and they're very, like, how would you say, they're very sort of like, I'm trying to think of the word to use. They're very, like, malleable to some degree. It's almost like playing with Legos, playing with stats, right? And a lot of times this doesn't kind of come through in the game, and I think that's because of how the game is balanced and designed. But, for example, like, you could create a game where it's a lot easier to die on trash than it currently is. And in that particular version of the game, it might be really beneficial for you to have more stamina, right? So you could create stat pieces that would seem inferior because they have more stamina on them, that you wouldn't want them as a DPS, right? But in reality, you might be like, actually, I'm just willing to give up this here, right? Because if I give up a couple damage stats on this item, and this item, I can get 500 more HP. And that's going to save me, and it's going to save my world buffs, whether or not they decide to use those. It's just going to save your consumes, save your uptime. So you can balance that, the fact that we have a very strict BIS list, typically, for DPS in particular. I think it's actually not quite as strict for healers, but the fact that we have a strict DPS list for, or strict gear list for DPS doesn't have to be that way. And you can add a lot of items that are like kind of similar but different in subtle ways with stats that are kind of hard to do it's hard to do in a system where you just have something that either has the absolute best stats because the content isn't challenging enough in any way, or this system, right? Because it sounds like what's going to happen with this system is that you're just going to end up getting your AoE set or whatever type of set it is, your movement set, your CC set, whatever it is. You're going to need these core pieces, and you're never taking them off for that content, right? You might take them off to go back and do old content. I get that, but like there's no decision making in that particular phase of the game, and you sort of run into this problem where it seems like you have a lot of choice, right? And the idea is like, hey, I can adapt my set for different situations. But in reality, what's happening is it's almost like done for you, right? Because if you're going into the heavy AoE content, there's no way you're not using the AoE set, right? If you literally can't do the mechanics of a raid without using the movement set, then there's no way you're going into that raid without using the movement set, right? So realistically, it seems like you have a lot of options, but you're kind of just forcing players to use a specific set of gear for a specific dungeon or raid, if that makes sense, right? So at that point, it becomes less about you constructing something cool and you just collecting the necessary prerequisites to do said thing. It becomes basically no different than resist gear, realistically, right? It's a bit more, maybe it's a little bit cooler in the sense that it's giving you stuff that you didn't have before, like maybe a movement ability, but it's the same kind of idea behind resist gear, where it's like you just need to hit this arbitrary threshold of people with the gear to be able to do the content. And I don't think it really does a lot for player choice or anything of that nature, right? So And this could even be kind of brought down even more. So for like, I see another example where people, instead of stuff like AoE or CC or speed, people talk about, well, why don't you have different types of damage? So for example, like if you're a melee character, maybe you have slash, maybe you have crush, maybe you have something else. And the idea is like certain bosses would be crush deficient, right? And certain bosses would be slash deficient. And the idea is that you just get gear to fit that niche, and then you're fine, right? But that becomes the same part of the problem. Like, you're never going to go on a fight that has a boss that is like is vulnerable to crush damage and bring slash gear. Like, you're always like, it's just always beneficial to have that in your item rack or whatever we want to use for this new Classic Plus, and swap it out to that, right? So it's like, in some sense, it's like all the items are like, that's almost a worse problem than we have now. And I'd explain it like, think about it like this, right? In the current system with stats, and again, if we made the stats, let's say, more relevant, right? So maybe in certain cases you wanted a little bit more health or something like that, right? Or you wanted gear that can just provide you a bit more survivability in any given way. At least in the system that we have now, what you could do is you could be like, well, this item might be a little worse, but I'm going to like trade this item for that item. So he can get that item. I'm willing to take the item that's a little bit worse in this case because maybe it's easier to get or makes me a little bit tankier. Or, maybe the idea is like, yeah, he's going to have more consistent damage, but if I get this item, I have more spike burst damage, right? And I'm willing to make that trade-off. You have some people that'll go into the more consistent damage. Maybe they want like a better overall parse for the entire raid. You have other people that are trying to like parse on a boss or something like that. So they'll be like, oh, I'll take this other item that's going to give me a little bit more damage up front, right? And you can kind of trade pieces back and forth. With these types of systems where you kind of, the players need the items or the set pieces or set bonuses, what's going to happen is now like everybody needs the same items, right? So like every warrior in your raid is like competing for the same, whether it be tier token or whatever other piece of item it is, right? And it's going to be the same thing if you try and do like the slash and crush problem, right? Like now every warrior is going to want a set for when they are fighting a mob that's weak to slash, when they're fighting a mob that's weak to crush, right? And they're going to optimally swap into that between every encounter is sort of the idea with like an item rack thing. And the game sort of becomes like, okay, we're just constantly swapping gear every moment. But it's not necessarily it's not like we're thinking on the fly, and it's not like you're in PvP, World PvP in WoW, and you have different trinkets, like on your rogue or something, and you're swapping in to adapt to a given situation. Yeah, you're technically adapting to a situation, but you already know what the situation is beforehand, right? Everything is like pre-rehearsed and kind of pre-planned, and it's not like you can kind of you can't really be screwed in any way. Like in the World PvP example, and why some of the item rock stuff is cool in PvP, because once you use something, it's on cooldown, and now you can't use it again, right? So let's say you use your Renatakis on Rogue. Now it's on cooldown for 3 minutes. Now you have to pivot to something else because that trinket slot is basically dead, right? And maybe you actually want Renatakis for the next fight you're going into, but you don't have it because it's already on cooldown. So now you have to get creative and think about, okay, what's the next best option to deal with this this like next target that I have to fight or something like that, right? Whereas in this, it's just going to be you already know everything essentially, right? Like you're going in like, okay, I'm going to have my crush gear on for this, my slash gear on for this, my stem, and you just kind of you don't have to really think much about what you're doing outside of setting it up in the beginning, and then it's just like kind of set and forget. And it creates like an incredible demand for all these pieces. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem. Like, it could be a situation where you just have way more loot in this version of Classic, right? And that could be a thing, right? It could be like way easier to acquire these pieces, okay? But assuming we're trying to keep something like loot scarcity in the game, I think it'd be like really difficult to kind of run with a system like this, right? So yeah, I think stats kind of get ragged on, but I think it's kind of because people are not like the devs don't force you to make hard decisions, and it is difficult for them to do because here's the problem, right? And this is kind of always the case where you have like it's really exemplified well when you have a glass cannon kind of archetype character versus where you can make it a little bit tankier. The best players in the world, almost all the time, the glass cannon is going to be better, right? Unless the content is made super hard, and then and then at that point, it's no point to even risk you dying, and you go with the tankier set, right? So it does tend to become this binary, and it is really hard to kind of hit that balance, right? Where the idea is like, you're actually willing to trade gear, because the idea is that one of them is probably always going to be just better. It's really difficult to strike that balance for the majority of players, and I get that. But I think trying to strike it is better than kind of doing something like this, where, everybody is essentially going to be wanting kind of the same thing if you're like a warrior in this raid, right? Like the homogenization is just going to be absolutely insane. So yeah, just some things to think about there. Overall, this was like a good video. I mean, like, he put effort into this. This is like the ideas are good. They're very good at solving the problem. I would say this kind of almost goes back to that. This might have this video right here may have been in response to the video I'm going to talk about. But what I was going to say is this is sort of I think a callback to that video I made where it's like, we can solve any problem we want in the game, but we just have to be aware of the consequences of doing so. And I think the consequences of solving the vertical progression problem in a game like WoW are going to be generally undesirable. And I personally wouldn't like a lot of the outcomes I think that a system like this would produce. That doesn't mean that it's like wrong or bad, right? You could have a system like this, for sure. Like, what he's saying is coherent. There's a logic to all this, right? It all follows, it all works. So it's not like a bad idea. It's just very different, in my opinion, from what WoW currently is. And I think that a lot of people's vision for WoW Classic is not really to make it super different, which is why I never really understood the idea of trying to go into horizontal progression. I think it was more to finish out the base game and, probably slow the gear progression overall. But I don't think that people wanted to get away from horizontal progression, if that makes sense. And one final thing that I'll kind of talk about with the horizontal and vertical progression argument that I didn't really get to touch on in the other two videos that I kind of made about this, and why, I don't really think vertical progression is much of a problem, is because people, again, they always use RuneScape as the game for horizontal progression, right? Not saying he did that here, but I'm just saying in general. And I think with horizontal progression, you almost need to lean into the solo play more, right? It's something that works really well for solo players because the idea is it's very easy for you to go out and acquire all the things, right? And because you're doing it solo, you don't really run into this bottleneck problem either. So not only do you not need help, which is a great thing, right? Because if you want to do something in the game and you require having the help of other players to get an item that allows you to do a certain thing, it can kind of feel bad for players, right? So not only do you not run into that problem, but you don't run into the gear bottleneck problem that we're talking about, where it's like, okay, now we're in a raid, everybody wants this item, and maybe only so many of them drop. Like I said, again, you can fix that problem if you want to add more gear into the game, but that's going to be controversial for a lot of people. So I think a lot of the horizontal stuff really works in a solo game like RuneScape, but it doesn't work quite as well in a game like WoW, where the whole idea is supposed to be grouping. And I also think that, especially with the decision that Blizzard made about GDKP, like the reason why they said they removed GDKP is because they want to kind of like encourage community cohesion and more community play, and they want people to kind of build community. They're talking about guilds, basically. Like, the idea is Blizzard sees, like everybody else sees, that, for a Pug player, GDKP is really appealing. But their argument is kind of like, okay, we get it, but realistically, guys, just playing as a Pug is not going to be the ideal way to play this game. Sorry, like, they're kind of drawing a line in the sand there, right? They're like, we get it. It's more convenient for you to use GDKP if you're a Pug, right? Because it has essentially the gold is a server-wide equity thing. Makes total sense. But we don't care about that at Blizzard because we want you guys to be playing as a group. We want this to be a group-based game. That's our vision. That's our thought. And a game does have to have a vision like that overall. They're choosing that for a WoW Classic, in my opinion, when they're making these decisions about GKP. So I don't think that they really want to go into like a play style where it becomes easy to acquire these things, or like, you know, you can acquire them solo, which means I think it's going to be really hard to utilize horizontal progression in the same way that a game like RuneScape does to its fullest and things of that nature, right? So I know he's not talking about RuneScape in the video, but just another, like, kind of another knock, I feel like, against horizontal progression in the game. So to sum everything up, I will, like, it's a great video. You know, he put effort into it. It's logically coherent. There's nothing wrong with the video per se. I just don't think I would like the game to go in this direction. I can't speak for other players. I think there's a lot of people though that if they didn't get if they didn't get a character that just felt objectively more powerful from the next tier, they would be sad about it. That's my take from the community at large. Maybe I'm off base about that. But yeah, and I would disagree with the core premise that vertical progression is like inherently bad. Like there are some problems with it, but again, because we're not in media or telling a story, or, you know, we're having to worry about creating cool combat in a fighter anime, we don't have to deal with a lot of the problems that were kind of brought up in that analogy, and we can just brute force things by, you know, retooling content, sprucing it up, reusing it in different ways and things of that nature. And I think that's kind of like the way to go forward if you're going to try and do something like Classic Plus, where you want the content to be viable for longer, if that makes sense. Like there's other ways, like you can kind of make that happen, and then once you really hit the maximum limit, you can just redo the content or you know, move the gear to something else. So yeah, it's a great video. I just don't know if I agree with the premise or the solutions to the supposed problem. You know, like the bottom line is I'm not sure if this vertical progression thing is as much of a problem as people are making it out to be. To kind of sum up one last thing about this is, I don't think that the reason why people that like, not saying that everybody that likes Classic doesn't like the Burning Crusade, but what I'm saying is that group of people that really loves Classic and doesn't like retail, right? It's probably a better way to put it instead of using the Burning Crusade. The reason why they don't like retail has nothing to do with vertical progression, in my opinion. It's about kind of a bunch of design changes and kind of themes that were made over a long period of time that just changed the very nature of the game to be way less sandboxy, into a game that's like way more streamlined and almost kind of like a raid or PvP sim. And there's almost nothing to do with like the world in the game in retail, or you don't have to interact with the world at least, right? So I think that is the main reason why a lot of Classic people dislike retail. I don't think it has anything to do with the progression. I think the progression, because it's so rapid with the expansions, seems to be like a symptom of the problem. And also keep in mind that every time they've done like progression, they've added a lot of power creep with the progression. So the problem is, it's not just that like all your gear got erased instantly with the next expansion, which is probably bad, right? And most people probably don't have great feelings about that. But also, new abilities get added that, you know, just gave insane power creep, essentially. Or, you know, new items get added that added insane power creep. So it's less about the vertical progression in itself and kind of more about how it was done, and then just other game development decisions that were made. They decided to basically take the game in a different direction after a certain point, and that's what people who love Classic don't like about retail. I don't really think it's strictly to do with the fact that you kind of get stronger every expansion, even though there's Classic people probably think that there are better ways to do that, and there are, right? It doesn't have to be quite the gap that we see, right? You don't want to be replacing your Naxx items probably with like level 68 items from Outland. But you guys kind of get the point there. So yeah, thank you so much for letting me react to the video, Maddie, because this was really fun to do. And yeah, like none of this criticism is meant to be like harsh or anything like that. Like I said, everything's logically coherent. It makes sense. It's a good video. I just would personally disagree with, like, I wouldn't want this to be in my version of WoW Classic. But yeah, so thanks so much for watching, guys. If you like this, like, comment, and subscribe. And I will talk to you guys next time. See ya.